A laboratory in Ulsan, South Korea. The year is 2020. A team of geneticists has just finished something that had never been done before. They sequenced 88 Korean genomes in full and then ran them against every major population in the human genetic record, every ancient civilization, every modern nation. 115 ancient genomes spanning 40,000 years of human history. The software returned its result. The closest match to modern Koreans was not Chinese, not Japanese, not Mongolian, not any living population at all. It was a woman who died 7,700 years ago in a cave in Russia. Dr. Jong Bhak at UNIST, that's the Ulsan National Institute of Science and Technology, had been building toward this moment for years. His team's study, published in Genome Biology and Evolution in 2020, found that the genetic makeup of modern Koreans is best explained by a combination of two ancient populations. One was from the Russian Far East, specifically from a site called Devil's Gate Cave, near the Yamnaya River, 35 kilometers north of what is now the North Korean border. The other came from Southeast Asia, from Iron Age Cambodia and Vietnam. People who lived and died before any Korean kingdom had a name. Think about that for a second. The DNA of 52 million people, the genetic foundation of one of the most culturally distinct nations on Earth, traces back to a woman in a cave that nobody alive has ever heard of, and to a Southeast Asian farming population whose name has never been recorded. Everything you think you know about where Koreans come from? Hold on to that, because it's about to mean something completely different. This isn't just a story about Korea. If you have East Asian ancestry, or really any ancestry at all, the method behind what happened here might be the method behind your story too. And if you've ever wanted to understand where people really come from, not the myth, not the textbook, but what the actual genome found, then stay in this, because what the data revealed next is something the field still doesn't have a full answer for. Before we go further, I want to know something about you. Has your family ever told you a story about where you really come from? Not the country on your passport, the deeper story. A village, a migration, an ancestor nobody talked about. Drop it in the comments, because what this DNA is about to show us might be the oldest version of that story, and it predates every map that's ever been drawn. The Korean genome, all 88 samples, clustered into a single, undivided genetic group. No regional differences, no subgroups, one clean cluster. 52 million people, compressed into one genomic fingerprint. And the reason for that compression is not what anyone expected. That compression is real, it's documented, and it breaks one of the most widely held assumptions in East Asian history. Here's what Dr. Seungwon Jeon's team found when they ran the admixture analysis. That's the calculation that estimates when and how different ancestral populations blended together to create a modern group. At the deepest level of resolution, Koreans carry two genetic components. Roughly 38% comes from an East Siberian lineage, ancient, northern, cold. The other 62% comes from a Southeast Asian lineage, southern, agricultural, Iron Age. And here's the number that stopped the research team in their tracks. The estimated date of that blend, the moment when the Korean genome as we know it today began to take shape, is approximately 3,583 years ago. Not ancient, not prehistoric. 3,583 years ago. That's the Bronze Age. That's before any unified Korean state. That's before the Three Kingdoms period. That's before almost everything Koreans are taught to remember as the beginning of their history. And yet, the data said the exact opposite of what every textbook currently teaches. The standard story of Korean identity is one of deep, unbroken continuity. One people, one peninsula, one lineage going back to the mythological founder Dangun, king of Gojoseon, born, according to tradition, around 2333 BCE. The genome says, the genetic structure most of us call Korean was assembled not by ancient continuity, but by a rapid population influx from outside the peninsula, just 3,583 years ago. The ancient part is not the homogeneity. The ancient part is the raw material. The homogeneity itself is comparatively new, and it came from the south. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. The southern component in the Korean genome, that 62%, traces most specifically to Iron Age populations from Cambodia and Vietnam. not Han Chinese, not any population Korea has ever been in documented contact with through its own historical records. People from Southeast Asia, farmers, people who, as far as we can tell from the current evidence, have no named civilization, no migration story, no identified archaeological trail leading to the Korean peninsula. They contributed the majority of what makes a Korean genetically Korean, and nobody has found their name. But the northern layer is even older. The East Siberian component in modern Koreans, that 38%, has an estimated admixture date of 5,482 years ago. Before Gojoseon, before bronze, before any documented Korean cultural marker of any kind. Koreans are not a recent people who arrived from somewhere. They are a convergence point, where two ancient migration waves that had been traveling toward each other for thousands of years finally met. And what they made has a name we all know. What they were does not. Older still, before the Bronze Age wave, before Mumun pottery, before any of the arrival stories, there was the northern signal. And the face of that signal is one woman. She died approximately 7,700 years ago in a limestone cave above a river in what is now Russia's Primorsky Krai, a region that sits on a modern map directly above North Korea. Soviet archaeologist Alexei Okladnikov excavated the site in 1973. He found her bones alongside comb-patterned ceramics and fish remains. He knew the site was important. He could not have known she was Korean. Or rather, he could not have known that the people who would one day be called Korean were, in part, her descendants. Dr. Veronika Siska at the University of Cambridge spent years on this specific question. In 2017, her international team, working with researchers from UNIST in South Korea, from Germany, from Russia, extracted and sequenced the Devil's Gate genome. Then they ran it against 25 present-day populations. The result came back. Modern Koreans were among her closest living relatives. This study was published in 2017. It received almost no mainstream coverage. Until now. But here's the detail that changes everything. The Korean match to the Devil's Gate woman was not through the Ulchi, the small indigenous group in the Russian Far East who are her most direct cultural descendants. Koreans didn't inherit this ancestry secondhand. They show an independent, direct genetic affinity to the Devil's Gate lineage, which means Koreans and the Ulchi both separately descended from the same ancient population. Two branches, same root. The root is 7,700 years old and has no name. Now, this is where the founding myth and the founding genome go in completely different directions. Korean national identity rests on the concept of Dan-il Minjok, one people, one lineage stretching back to Dangun, the mythological king born around 2333 BCE. It is one of the most powerful origin narratives in the world, and the genome says the oldest genetic signal in every Korean alive today predates Dangun by more than 5,000 years. It traces to a hunter-gatherer woman in a Siberian cave. The myth names a king. The DNA names a cave. This isn't just ancient history. If you have any East Asian ancestry at all, some version of this signal is in your genome right now. And the woman from Devil's Gate was not alone. Two individuals were sequenced at that site. The second individual, also Neolithic, also matching Korean ancestry, was found with fishing tools and clay vessels. They were eating. They were there. Their biology is inside 52 million people who go about their days without knowing it. But here is where the story gets genuinely strange. The model in the 2020 Korean study requires a third source population to fully explain the Korean genome. Not Devil's Gate, not any living Southeast Asian group. A third population, the one that contributed that 62%, that dominant southern wave, which cannot be matched to any named archaeological culture anywhere in the current record. They shaped the majority of Korean genetic identity, and they have no name. And neither did the people who replaced them in Europe. 5,000 years ago, the continent of Europe was home to people who had been there for 4,000 years. They built Stonehenge. They built the megalithic tombs of Ireland and France and Malta. They developed the first large-scale agricultural systems on the continent. They were complex. They were established. And then, within a few centuries, their genome was almost entirely written over. The people who did it are called the Yamnaya. They came from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, modern Ukraine and Russia. Dr. Wolfgang Haak at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany led a study published in Nature in 2015 that analyzed the DNA of 69 Europeans across 8,000 years. What he found was described by his team as among the largest demographic turnovers documented in genetic history. The Neolithic farmers of Europe, the people who built the monuments, were genomically replaced with a speed that the ancient DNA record had never shown before. The Yamnaya have a name. Their victims have a pottery classification. There are 3 things this parallel reveals. The third one changes how you read every history book ever written. First, the Neolithic European replacement and the Iron Age Southeast Asian influx into Korea are structurally identical events. Same genomic signature, an incoming wave overwrites the resident population within a few centuries. Same archaeological marker, pottery type changes abruptly at the transition point. Same historical outcome, the new population inherits the land, absorbs fragments of the existing culture, and the previous people become invisible in the written record. Second, this is not a Korean story. This is not a European story. This is the method, the documented, genome-confirmed, apparently repeatable method by which human civilization builds itself on top of what came before without recording what it destroyed. Third, and this is the one that stays with you, the Korean version of this erasure is more complete than the European one. At least the Yamnaya have a name. At least the Neolithic Europeans have a regional classification. The Southeast Asian population that contributed 62% of modern Korean genetic structure has neither. They covered their own tracks more thoroughly than any other group in the ancient DNA record. Actually, if you caught my last video on the Yamnaya and the erasure of Neolithic Europe, you already saw the blueprint for exactly what happened in Korea. What hit you hardest in that one? Tell me in the comments, because what's coming next shows us the living people who carry the aftermath of this right now in their cells today. And those people number exactly 2,700. The Ulchi people live in about 16 small villages along the Amur River in Russia's Khabarovsk region. The 2020 Russian census counted 2,765 of them. Their language, a Tungusic branch called Ulchi, has somewhere between 100 and 200 fluent native speakers left. They fish the Amur the way their ancestors fished the rivers near Devil's Gate Cave. They perform ceremonies whose oldest ritual language predates the Tungusic language family itself. Some of those ancient words have no confirmed translation. The elders who perform the ceremony learned them phonetically, sounds passed down through generations, meaning no longer attached. They are transmitting something. They no longer know what it says. What they found next changed everything we thought we knew about who the Ulchi actually are. Dr. Veronika Siska's team discovered something in the data that is easy to miss and impossible to forget once you see it. The Ulchi are the closest living population to the Devil's Gate genome, but Koreans don't carry the Devil's Gate ancestry through the Ulchi. It's not that Koreans are descended from the same people the Ulchi descended from in a straight line. It's that Koreans and Ulchi both independently carry DNA from the same, even older ancestor, a population that predates both groups. They are not parent and child, they are cousins, separated by 7,700 years, meeting only in the genome of a dead woman in a cave. There is a man named Nikolai Beldy. He was born in 1929 in the Ulchi village of Puir on the Amur River. He became the most celebrated Ulchi folk musician of the Soviet era. In 1963, he recorded traditional Ulchi songs for the Leningrad Phonographic Archive, songs whose oldest verses contain vocabulary that linguists have traced back further than the recognizable Tungusic language tree. Those recordings still exist. They sit in an archive. They are the sound of a world that the genome says produced modern Koreans. Nobody in Korea knows his name. The Tungusic language family is classified as endangered by UNESCO. Ulchi itself is critically endangered. Between 5 and 8 fluent speakers are lost every year. When the last fluent Ulchi speaker dies, the last acoustic trace of that ancestral world disappears. The genetic signal will remain inside every Korean, inside the few remaining Ulchi themselves. but the voice will be gone. And here is the thing that stopped me cold when I was researching this. The analysis in the 2020 Korean genome study found that the group with the highest genetic affinity to modern Koreans, among all present-day populations in the comparison set, is not the Chinese, not any Siberian group, not the Ulchi. It is the Japanese. Two nations with 2,000 years of documented conflict, colonial occupation, competing territorial claims, the deepest political wound in East Asian history, and the genome places them as sister clades, branches of the same ancestral tree, separated approximately 2,827 years ago, before either modern national identity existed, before the first recorded war between them. The genome does not know about the wars. Those wars, the 663 CE Battle of Baekgang, the 1592 Imjin invasion, the 1910 annexation, 45 years of colonial rule, the comfort women, dokdo, the lawsuits that are still in Korean courts right now, 2,000 years of documented conflict between two nations, and the Kim et al. Study found that modern Koreans and modern Japanese share the highest mutual genetic affinity of any two populations in the East Asian comparison set. Their ancient admixture histories are, statistically speaking, almost indistinguishable. The data separates them at approximately 2,827 years ago, before either civilization had the political vocabulary to become enemies. Everything I just told you about Korean-Japanese genetic kinship, hold on to it, because it's about to mean something completely different in the context of what comes next. For 5 segments, this story has been told in the language of population genetics, admixture events, source populations, outgroup F3 statistics, ancestral clade assignments. This language was developed by scientists for precision, but precision, when applied to the disappearance of entire peoples, can become a kind of courtesy. And I want to stop using it for a moment. When we say population replacement, we are describing people who were there and then were not. When we say unnamed source population, we are describing a civilization that shaped the lives of 52 million people and left no name because the record did not survive their absorption. And when we say admixture event, with reference to over 70% of Korean genetic structure, we're describing a transformation so total that the people who went through it became, within a few generations, something their great-grandparents would not have recognized as their own descendants. The clinical language is accurate. It is also the most polite possible description of something for which no polite word exists. A Korean woman in Seoul, documented in a 2019 report from the DNA service MyHeritage, received her ancestry results and discovered her closest ancient genetic relative in the database was the Devil's Gate sample. She wrote, "I don't know how to feel about this. I thought I knew where I came from. Now I know I come from somewhere that doesn't have a name." Her comment received over 4,000 responses. Most people agreed. A significant number found it threatening. Both reactions were correct. Because here is the political edge of this. Korean ethno-nationalism, the claim to a pure, ancient, single-origin people, has been used across different eras by different political actors to justify very different things. The genome data does not contradict Korean identity, but it does contradict one specific claim that has been made in its name. The homogeneity of the Korean genome is not evidence of ancient, unbroken lineage. It is evidence of a rapid Bronze Age and Iron Age population influx from outside the peninsula that overwrote approximately 70% of the pre-existing genetic structure. The argument for ethnic purity cites the data. The data says the opposite. The DNA is not political, but its implications are. What the data actually shows, not filtered, not softened, is this: 70%. More than 70% of the genetic structure of the modern Korean population derives from a rapid admixture event that occurred approximately 3,583 years ago. A southern influx. People from outside the peninsula, people whose specific identity we cannot confirm. They arrived during the Bronze Age transition, when Jeulmun gave way to Mumun, when comb pottery was replaced by plain pottery, when wet rice agriculture appeared on the peninsula seemingly overnight. They left almost no named trace in any archaeological record, and they built the genomic foundation that 52 million people stand on today. The Jeulmun people, the original inhabitants, the carriers of that northern Devil's Gate lineage, the people who had been on the peninsula for thousands of years, were not erased. Their DNA is still there. It is in that 38% East Siberian component. The haplogroup O2b SRY465, the Y chromosome marker that is so specifically concentrated on the Korean peninsula that geneticists concluded it originated there. That haplogroup belongs to them. It is the oldest continuous genetic signal in Korea. It predates every dynasty, every kingdom, every legend, and it is a minority within the genome of the culture it helped create. This is the thing that the data has been building toward the entire time. The people most responsible for the founding of Korean genetic identity, the ones who contributed the majority, the dominant wave, the 62%, cannot be found. Not in the archaeological record, not in any named civilization, not in any documented migration. They are visible only as a frequency, as a percentage, as a shape in the data that can be described but not named. Dr. Jong Bhak's team at UNIST confirmed it. The admixture model for Koreans, cross-validated at multiple levels of genetic resolution, requires a source population that best resembles Iron Age individuals from sites in Cambodia and Vietnam, Vat Komnou and Nui Nap, but is not identical to them. The actual source population existed somewhere between those ancient Southeast Asian farmers and the Korean peninsula. It moved north. It arrived. It stayed. It became the majority component of what the world now calls Korean. And it left no inscription, no myth, no monument, no confirmed name. You are looking at the genomic record of 52 million people, and the largest piece of that record points to someone no one can introduce by name. Here is something the genomic modeling can tell us that history cannot. At some point, somewhere in Southeast Asia, sometime between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago, there was a population. They were farmers. They had a genetic profile that, when run through a modern comparison model, most closely resembles the Iron Age individuals buried at Vat Komnou in Cambodia and Nui Nap in Vietnam. They were not famous. They had no empire. As far as we can tell, they left no monument that anyone has correctly identified as theirs. But some of them moved. North. Through southern China, across the Yellow Sea corridor, or along the coastal routes that archaeologists are still mapping. Some of them reached the Korean peninsula, and when they got there, when they met the Jeulmun people who had been living there for thousands of years, what happened next produced a genetic event that population models estimate as one of the most rapid demographic consolidations in East Asian prehistory. Within roughly 2 to 3 centuries, the genomic profile of the peninsula shifted, not gradually, fast. The kind of change that, in the data, looks less like cultural diffusion and more like demographic replacement. Now, here is the thing about that fork in the road. The modeling tells us something almost impossible to process. The timing of this event, combined with its scale and speed, suggests that the population who became Korean was the result of a near miss, a contingency, a branch of a much larger migration that could have gone differently, that probably did go differently in other directions, with those branches disappearing entirely or merging into populations we call something else today. The branch that reached the Korean peninsula survived, consolidated, became singular, became what we now recognize as one of the most genetically uniform large populations in the world. The alternative timelines had no Koreans in them. This particular branch of this particular migration survived a winter, crossed a valley, reached a peninsula. And 52 million people are alive because of it. That is not a metaphor. That is the implication of the genomic evidence. There are researchers right now, at UNIST in South Korea, at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, at universities across East and Southeast Asia, who are working on the next phase of this. Ancient DNA extraction from Bronze Age Korean sites, full genome sequencing of more Iron Age Cambodian and Vietnamese samples, computational modeling of the migration routes between Southeast Asia and the Korean peninsula in the 2nd millennium BCE. The answer is not here yet. The study that names the source population, the one that gives the 62% a face, a location, a cultural marker, has not been published. It may not exist for another decade. It may never exist if the burial sites have not survived, if the DNA has degraded past recovery, if the record kept its silence too well. This is not a gap in the science. This is a feature of the science. Population genetics can tell you that a people existed. It can tell you when they moved, roughly how many there were, what percentage of a modern population descends from them. It cannot tell you what they called themselves. It cannot give you the name they used for the sky, or the word they had for home, or the story they told their children about where they came from. The genome is a record with no language. And now I want to ask you something directly. If you are Korean, or if you have Korean ancestry anywhere in your family tree, then somewhere in your cells right now, there is a genetic signal from a population that has no confirmed name. The majority of your ancient ancestry traces to people who moved north through Southeast Asia sometime around 1500 BCE and reached a peninsula. They became you. And the oldest piece of you, that 38%, the Devil's Gate thread, the Jeulmun hunter-gatherer signal, the haplogroup that originated on the peninsula itself, that piece has been there longer than anyone has been counting. You did not come from one place. You came from a convergence, a meeting point of at least two ancient migrations that had no plan to find each other. And what they built, what they became, through whatever process of contact and change the Bronze Age peninsula made possible, is something the genome can measure, but the history books cannot fully explain. The science is still running. The models are still being refined. Somewhere in a laboratory right now, a genome is being sequenced that might answer the question this video raised, or it might raise a larger one. The woman in Devil's Gate Cave died 7,700 years ago with fish bones beside her and ceramic vessels near her hands. She had no idea she was Korean. She had no idea what Korean meant. She had no idea that the biological information in her body would one day be extracted by scientists, run through a comparative model, and returned as the closest ancient match to a modern nation of 52 million people. She just ate. She just lived. She just died in her cave above the river, and she is inside you.